Okay, so welcome to the deep dive, everybody. Today we're going to be diving into something that's been in the news a lot recently.
Yeah.
A lot of people have been asking about it.
Yeah.
And you sent me over some really interesting stuff about it.
It's fascinating stuff.
Yeah, so we're gonna take a deep dive into what is being called the de-extinction
Yeah.
of the dire wolf
Yep.
from the Ice Age.
Yeah, these big scary wolves you always see on like Game of Thrones and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and like you said, Game of Thrones and just all sorts of, fantasy stuff.
Right.
And people are really, fascinated by these creatures.
Yeah, I mean I'm fascinated by them and I think a lot of people are. I mean they're just these huge iconic predators.
Yeah.
And the idea that we might be able to bring something like that back is just so captivating.
Yeah. So the company Colossal Biosciences
Right.
has claimed that they've done it. They've de-extincted a dire wolf.
They announced the birth of 3 pups, Romulus, Remus, and Khaleesi.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, they gave them some pretty epic names.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Yeah.
you got to go big or go home.
Right, exactly.
So let's talk about dire wolves first of all, just so people have kind of a baseline.
Yeah.
These creatures lived during the Pleistocene, so about 250,000
Yeah, the Ice Age.
to about 10,000 years ago, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And they roamed North America.
Yep.
And they were huge.
They're huge. They were bigger than gray wolves.
Yeah, like much bigger.
Yeah, like, 150 pounds, maybe even bigger.
Wow.
Yeah, and their teeth and jaws were just massive.
Yeah, like they ate some pretty big prey, right?
Oh, yeah. They were hypercarnivores, which means they primarily ate meat.
Okay.
And they went after some of the biggest things around,
Like what?
like horses and bison and even mammoths sometimes.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, so,
Yeah.
You're talking about some serious predatory power.
Yeah, yeah. And so they died out, you said, around 10,000 years ago.
Yeah, roughly around the end of the last ice age.
And what do scientists think caused them to go extinct?
Well, it's probably a combination of factors.
Okay.
The biggest one is probably the disappearance of their prey.
Right, right.
Those big megafauna, like the mammoths and the giant sloths.
Yeah.
They started disappearing around that time, too.
Okay.
And then you had climate change.
Okay.
The world was warming up. The glaciers were receding.
Right.
So that was definitely putting pressure on them. And then maybe some increased competition from other predators like gray wolves.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Yeah. So it's probably a perfect storm of events that led to their extinction.
Okay, so now let's talk about how they're claiming to have brought them back.
Okay.
Yeah, because
This is where the science gets really interesting.
yeah, this is where it gets a little fuzzy for me. So help me out here.
Sure. So there are a few different ways that people talk about bringing back extinct animals. One is cloning,
Right.
which is what they did with Dolly the sheep.
Yeah.
But that requires having intact DNA, which is really, really hard to come by for extinct animals.
Right, right.
Another is backbreeding.
Okay, what is that?
So that's where you try to breed existing animals to select for traits that resemble the extinct animal.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of like selective breeding, but on a much grander scale.
Okay, okay.
But Colossal Biosciences, they're using a different approach. They're using CRISPR.
Okay, so CRISPR is
It's a gene editing technology that allows scientists to make very precise changes to DNA.
okay. All right. So how did they use CRISPR to do this with dire wolves?
So the first thing they did was extract ancient DNA from direwolf fossils.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they actually got DNA from a 13,000-year-old fossil from Ohio
Wow.
and a 72,000-year-old fossil from Idaho.
That's amazing.
It's pretty incredible.
Yeah, like just the fact that they can do that is amazing to me.
I know, it's amazing. And then they compared that ancient DNA to the genome of the modern gray wolf.
Okay.
And they identified about 20 genetic differences.
Okay.
These are called SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms.
Okay.
But you can just think of them as little variations in the DNA code.
Okay.
And they believe that these 20 SNPs are responsible for some of the key traits that make dire wolves different from gray wolves.
So like what kind of traits?
Like their size,
Right.
their head shape, their coat color.
Oh, okay. So they're trying to basically recreate those traits
Exactly.
in a modern gray
Well,
wolf.
yeah, so they made these 20 edits to the DNA of gray wolf cells,
Okay.
and then they used those cells to create embryos,
Okay.
and those embryos were implanted into surrogate dog mothers.
Oh, wow. So they use dogs as surrogates.
Yeah, because dogs are closely related to wolves. So it's easier to get the embryos to implant and develop
Oh,
properly.
that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah. And that's how they got these 3 pups, Romulus, Remus, and Khaleesi.
And they're saying that these pups are exhibiting some of these dire wolf characteristics.
Yeah, that's what they're saying.
Okay.
They're larger than typical gray wolf pups.
Okay.
They have lighter coats.
Okay.
And they have more muscular jaws and broader heads.
Okay. So it sounds like they're on the right track.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like they've made some progress.
Yeah. Okay. But now, the big question is this really de-extinction?
Right. Is this really a dire wolf?
Yeah. Have they really brought back a dire wolf?
And that's where things get a little more complicated.
Okay. Yeah. So you sent me an article from Nature
Yeah.
that was published in 2021.
Mm-hmm.
And that really kind of threw a wrench into this whole idea.
Yeah, that study was a game changer.
Okay. So what did that study say?
Well, it showed that dire wolves weren't just a bigger, hairier version of gray wolves.
Okay.
They were actually a completely separate lineage
Okay.
that diverged from gray wolves about 5.7 million years ago.
5.7 million years. That's a
Yeah.
long time.
It's a huge amount of time.
Yeah.
And it means that there are millions of genetic differences between dire wolves and gray wolves.
Wow. Okay.
Not just those 20 that Colossal Biosciences edited.
Right.
And the study also found that there's no evidence that dire wolves ever interbred with gray wolves or coyotes.
Oh, wow.
So they were really their own distinct species.
Okay.
And in fact, the study suggests that dire wolves might be more closely related to African jackals than they are to gray wolves.
Wow. So all those similarities that we see between dire wolves and gray wolves,
Right.
that's just convergent evolution.
Exactly. It's like how bats and birds both have wings, but they evolve them independently.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yes.
Okay, so basically what you're saying is that even though they look similar,
Yeah.
genetically they're very, very different.
Very different.
Okay.
And that brings us to kind of the crux of the issue here. Colossal Biosciences talking about the 99.5% genetic similarity between dire wolves and gray wolves. But that 5.7 million years of separate evolution means that there are just millions of genetic differences that aren't being accounted for.
Okay.
So editing just those 20 SMPs is like,
It's a drop in the bucket.
it's a drop in the bucket. Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like changing the color of a few pixels on a giant screen.
Okay.
You're not really changing the image.
Right. Okay. So the scientists are basically saying that these pups,
Yeah.
they're not really dire wolves.
They're not really dire wolves.
Right.
They're genetically modified gray wolves
Yeah.
with a few traits that have been tweaked.
Right.
And even those traits, like the light coat,
Yeah.
that might be achieved through a different genetic pathway than what produced it in actual dire wolves.
Okay.
So it's not even a perfect replica of the trait.
Okay. So they're kind of dire wolfish,
Yeah, they're dire wolfish.
but they're not really dire wolves.
But they're not really dire wolves.
Okay. So it seems like the scientific consensus
Yeah.
is that Colossal has done some really cool,
Yeah.
impressive.
Yeah, they've done some amazing genetic engineering.
Yeah. But they're overselling it a little bit.
Yeah, I think de-extinction is probably an overstatement.
Yeah, I think so too.
At this point.
Yeah.
It's more like they've created a new breed of wolf
Right.
that has some dire wolf characteristics.
Yeah, but it's not really bringing back a species
Right.
that went extinct thousands of years ago.
Right. And there are some concerns about the ethics of all this too.
Oh, yeah. Let's talk about that for a second.
Yeah, because, is this really the best use of resources?
Right.
We have so many species that are endangered right now.
Right.
Shouldn't we be focusing on saving them
Yeah.
before we try to bring back things that are already gone?
Yeah. And what about the welfare of these animals?
Right.
They're genetically modified.
Yeah.
Who knows what kind of health problems they might have.
Exactly.
And what about the ecological impact?
Right. If they were to release these animals into the wild. Wow.
How would that affect the ecosystem?
Yeah.
Would they outcompete other predators?
Yeah.
Would they prey on livestock?
Yeah.
There are a lot of unknowns.
Yeah, there are a lot of unknowns. And so it's definitely something that we need to be thinking about very carefully.
Absolutely.
So, I think the big takeaway here is that
Yeah.
while the idea of bringing back extinct animals is really exciting,
Yeah, it's very cool.
the reality is a lot more complicated
It is.
than just, flipping a genetic switch.
Right.
And we need to be really careful about how we
Good.
proceed.
Yeah, and I think it raises a really interesting question for everyone to think about.
Yeah.
What does it actually mean to de-extinct something?
Right.
Is it enough to create an animal that looks like the extinct animal?
Yeah.
Or do we need to recreate its entire genome,
Yeah.
its entire evolutionary history?
Yeah.
And if we can do that,
What are the ethical implications of that?
yeah, that's a big question
It's a huge question.
that I think we're all going to have to grapple with
Yeah,
as this technology continues to develop.
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, this has been fascinating. Um, I think, you know, people need to think about this a lot more, and we need to continue
That's
to
right.
follow this and see what happens.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks for joining me on the deep dive,
Thanks for having me.
and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.